Hello, 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 everyone. My name is John Sierra, and I am a Tolkien scholar. And what that means is that I'm the sort of guy that you can come to with any sort of question about the works of J.R.R. Tolkien, whether it's The Hobbit, or The Lord of the Rings, or the Silmarillion, or any of his other stories, or translations, or the man himself, his teachings, his writings, anything you can think of, his linguistics. You know, that's actually one of my specialties, is the linguistics. And, yeah. And of course, if you have a question for me, you can just go ahead and ask me in the comments, and I'll get to it when I can. Or if you want to be featured in a video, you could submit it through a website called Quora. So Quora is a knowledge-sharing website where you could go and ask any sort of question about really anything you would like, and have people with relevant knowledge or expertise or experience answer your question. And if you ask any sort of question about Tolkien on there, you're going to be given a list of people to tag, to ask that question specifically of them, although anybody can answer, of course. And my name will be at or near the top of the list. And of course, if you look at the description to this very video, or any of my videos, there is a link directly to my Quora account. You might find that a little bit easier. And also, there's my Quora space, The Grey Havens, where you could read all of my writing, as well as a great deal of other writing by other individuals who I respect. That being said, we do have 10 questions to get through today. And also, another way that, somebody found me on Discord and asked me a question there, and they said, is this an appropriate place to ask a question? And I said, yes, go ahead, sure, And he asked the question. I gave sort of a quick answer, and I said, if you want like a longer answer, where I go into like a deep dive with some research and everything, you might want to submit it through Quora, because it'll go into a video, and I think, it would be interesting. But he also requested a reading of The Disaster of the Gladden Fields, so that's going to be our reading for this week. So just like the video, subscribe if you haven't already. I'll ask you again at the end of the video, and let's get going with a reading from Unfinished Tales, specifically the chapter, it's upside down, The Disaster of the Gladden Fields. I guess we'll start at the beginning of the chapter. After the fall of Sauron, Isildur, the son and heir of Elendil, returned to Gondor. There he assumed the Elendil as king of Arnor, and proclaimed his sovereign lordship over all the Dunedain in the north and in the south, for he was a man of great pride and vigor. He remained for a year in Gondor, restoring its order and defining its bounds. But the greater part of the army of Arnor returned to Eriador by the Númenórean road from the fords of Isen to Fornost. When he at last felt free to return to his own realm, he was in haste, and he wished to go first to Imladris, for he had left his wife and youngest son there, and he had, moreover, an urgent need for the counsel of Elrond. He therefore determined to make his way north from Osgiliath, up the vales of Anduin to Cirith Forn and Andrath, the high-climbing pass of the north that led down to Imladris. He knew the land well, for he had journeyed there often before the War of the Alliance, and he had marched that way to the war with men of eastern Arnor in the company of Elrond. It was a long journey, but the only way west and north to the road meeting in Arnor and then east to Imladris was far longer. As swift maybe for mounted men, but he had no horses fit for riding. Safer maybe in former days, but Sauron was vanquished, and the people of the Vales had been his allies in victory. He had no fear save for weather and weariness, but these men must endure whom needs send far abroad in Middle-earth. So it was, as told in the legends of later days, that the second year of the Third Age was waning when Isildur set forth from Osgiliath early in Avaneth, expecting to reach Imladris in 40 days, by mid-Narbeleth ere the winter drew nigh in the north. At the east gate of the bridge on a bright morning Elendil bade him farewell. Go now with good speed, and may the sun of your setting out not cease to shine on your road. With Isildur went his 3 sons, Elendil, Aratan, and Cirion, and his guard of 200 knights and soldiers, stern men of Arnor and war-hardened. Of their journey nothing is told until they had passed over the Dagorlad, and on northward into the wide and empty land south of Greenwood the Great. On the 20th day, as they came within sight of the forest crowning the highlands before them, with the distant gleam of the red and gold of Ivaneth, the sky became overcast, and a dark wind came up from the Sea of Rhûn, laden with rain. The rain lasted for 4 days, so when they came to the entrance of the vales between Lorien and Aemon Lanc, Isildur turned away from the Anduin, swollen with swift water, and went up the steep slopes on its eastern side to gain the ancient paths of the Sylvan Elves that ran near the eaves of the forest. So it came to pass that late in the afternoon of the 30th day of their journey they were passing the north borders of the Gladden Fields, marching along a path that led to Thranduil's realm, as it was then. The fair day was waning. Above the distant mountain clouds were gathering, reddened by the misty sun as it drew down towards them. The deeps of the valleys were already in grey shadow. The Dunedain were singing, for their day's march was near its end, and 3 parts of the long road to Imladris were behind them. To their right the forest loomed about them at top of steep slopes running down to their path, below which the descent into the valley bottom was gentler. Suddenly, as the sun plunged into cloud, they heard the hideous cries of orcs, and saw them issuing from the forest, and moving down the slopes yelling their war cries. In the dim light their number could only be guessed, but the Dunedain were plainly many times, even 10 times outnumbered. Isildur commanded a Thangail to be drawn up, a shield wall of 2 serried ranks that could be bent back at either end if outflanked, until at need it became a closed ring. If the land had been flat, or the slope in his favour, he would have formed his company into a Durnaith, and charged the orcs, hoping by the great strength of the Dunedain and their weapons to cleave a way through them and scatter them in dismay. But that could not now be done. A shadow of foreboding fell upon his heart. "The vengeance of Sauron lives on, though he may be dead," he said to Elendil, who stood beside him. "There is cunning and design here. We have no hope of help. Moria and Lorien are now far behind, and Thranduil 4 days' march ahead. As we bear burdens of worth beyond all reckoning," said Elendil, for he was in his father's confidence. The orcs were now drawing near. Isildur turned to his esquire Ottar. He said, "I give this now into your keeping," and he delivered to him the great sheath and the shards of Narsil, Elendil's sword. "Save it from capture by all means that you can find, and at all costs, even at the cost of being held a coward who deserted me. Take your companion with you, and flee. Go, I command you." Then Ottar kneeled and kissed his hand, and the 2 young men fled down into the dark valley. If the keen-eyed orcs marked their flight, they took no heed. They halted briefly, preparing their assault. First they let fly a hail of arrows, and then suddenly, with a great shout, they did as Isildur would have done, and hurled a great mass of their chief warriors down the last slope against the Dunedain, expecting to break up their shield wall. But it stood firm. The arrows had been unavailing against the Númenórean armor. The great men towered above the tallest orcs, and their swords and spears far outreached the weapons of their enemies. The onslaught faltered, broke, and retreated, leaving the defenders little harmed, unshaken, behind piles of fallen orcs. It seemed to Isildur that the enemy was withdrawing towards the forest. He looked back. The red rim of the sun gleamed out from the clouds as it went down behind the mountains. Night would soon be falling. He gave orders to resume the march at once, but to bend their course down toward the lower and flatter ground where the orcs would have less advantage. Maybe he believed that after their costly repulse they would give way, though their scouts might follow him during the night and watch his camp. That was the manner of orcs, who were most often dismayed when their prey could turn and bite. But he was mistaken. There was not only cunning in the attack, but fierce and relentless hatred. The orcs of the mountains were stiffened and commanded by grim servants of Barad-dûr, set out long before to watch the passes, and though it was unknown to them, the ring, cut from his black hand 2 years before, was still laden with Sauron's evil will, and called to all his servants for their aid. The Dunedain had gone scarcely a mile when the orcs moved again. This time they did not charge, but used all of their forces. They came down on a wide front which bent to a crescent and soon closed into an unbroken ring about the Dunedain. They were silent now, and kept at a distance out of the range of the dreaded steel bows of Númenor, though the light was fast falling and Isildur had all too few archers for his need. He halted. There was a pause, though the most keen-eyed among the Dunedain said that the orcs were moving inward, stealthily, step by step. Elendil went to his father, who was standing dark and alone, as if lost in thought. "Atarinya," he said, "what of the power that would cow these foul creatures and command them to obey you? Is it then of no avail? Alas, it is not, Senya. I cannot use it. I dread the pain of touching it, and I have not yet found the strength to bend it to my will. It needs one greater than I know myself to be. My pride has fallen. It should go to the keepers of the three. And that's where I'll choose to stop there. So a lot of really interesting things, Isildur, and his son, Meneldur, they're talking about the One Ring, and of course it was mentioned cut from his black hand 2 years ago. I had a really hilarious argument with someone on Quora once when I mentioned this was the second year of the Third Age, because it was 2 years after the fall of Sauron. And this guy came and left me a comment that I found very hard to discern exactly what he was saying, because it was so rambly, and, we sort of went back and forth a little bit where I was trying to understand him, and he was trying to explain himself, and what it came down to is that he kept saying, how could it be the year 2 if it's 2 years later? Shouldn't, and I'm like, that's how it works, He's like, so you're saying that Tolkien did not start the Third Age with the year 1? And I said, well, no, I didn't say anything of the sort. What made you think that? He said, you said 2 years later was the year 2. How could that be? And I'm like, I don't understand what you're saying, And he starts like talking to me as if I were, a small child who needed things explained in small, simple words, which is a very poor way of going about any sort of debate. If somebody's not understanding you, it's your fault. It's not the other person's fault. And what it came down to is he kept assuming that I was saying that there was some sort of year 0, and that's when Sauron fell. And that 2 years after that is year 2, and he's saying it shouldn't be that way because calendars don't have a year 0 and they start with the year 1. And all I could say is, my brother in Iluvatar, the year 2 of the Third Age is 2 years after the year 3441 of the Second Age. And then he stopped replying to me, and I think he got it. He understood that he seemed to think that the Third Age began the very moment that Isildur took the ring, that as soon as Sauron was defeated, boom, it was the year 1. But that's not how it works. They had to do the rest of the year first, and then upon New Year declare a new calendar and a new age. That's how it works. And I think he realized that, it is 2 years later, and it is the year 2 of the Third Age. And he never replied after that. I think he understood, and he might have been a bit embarrassed about the way that he had come off there. And this was something like, 7 or 8 replies back and forth. And somebody else came in and said, this has got to be the most entertaining back and forth I've ever seen on this site. Of course, talking about Quora. And I said, I've already shown it all to all my friends, and they think it's hilarious. Like, I'm like, look at this. Can you believe this argument? Like, I couldn't understand what he was thinking, because I couldn't imagine that anybody would be thinking in that manner, because it's so ridiculous. A little bit of notes on the linguistics. Now, note that Meneldur calls Isildur Atarinya, which is sort of, Atar is father, so it's sort of like, like dear father, and then of course he's called Senya, which is son, and of course, now here's another thing, and this is an argument that I have over and over again. We're going into arguments again, in that I have stated many times on Quora, on YouTube, elsewhere, that Isildur was trying to bring the ring to Elrond. And people say, no, he wasn't. And I said, yes, he was. And what makes you think that? I was like, well, he says it right there. It should go to the keepers of the three. Elrond, of course, wanted him to destroy the ring. Right when he, first came into it, Elrond came over and said, what have you got there? And this isn't the exact dialogue, but and he said to him that, something like that, whatever it may be, is probably no good, and it would be best to be destroyed. And he even sort of pointed to, they were right by Mount Doom. They never went inside like in the film where Elrond said, come with me, and he brought him to Sammath Naur and demanded that he throw the ring in. And Isildur says, like, pretty much the only line he has in the movie, where he looks at the camera and says no. And then it cuts right to the end of the disaster of the Gladden Fields, where he's lying dead in the river. But in this case, what happened is they had a conversation, and Elrond said, why don't you go and cast it into the fire? And Isildur sort of thought about it for a moment, and he said, no, I'm going to keep it as Weirgild for my losses. And Weirgild, it means man, and gild is sort of like gold, so it's sort of like the price of a man's life. And he's basically saying that as revenge for the death of his father, Elendil, and his brother, Anarion, he is going to take something from Sauron, and he's going to keep it in his family as an heirloom of his house. Because he's thinking that Sauron is dead. Note that he said that in the story there, that he thought that Sauron was dead. Of course, Sauron is not dead. He's momentarily inconvenienced. And we're going to talk a little bit about that in one of the answers coming up, about, when Sauron has a body and when he doesn't and stuff like that. But anyway, that's our reading. So we're going to get to the questions. We have 10 of them. And we're going to start with the first question pretty much right now. Our first question comes in by the request of Melody Guarino, who asks, is the father or mother of Goldberry one of the lesser Maia? So, there really aren't lesser Maia. Tolkien once considered that there would be a tier of angel lower than the Maia, and Goldberry may be a sort of a remnant of this earlier idea, but pretty much there are the greater angels, the Valar, and the lesser angels of the Maiar. Goldberry, much like her husband Tom Bombadil, they actually predate the Lord of the Rings by quite a bit, and they even predate the Hobbit, or at least the publication of the Hobbit. Tom originated as a poetic character that Tolkien based off of his Dutch doll that his children had, and his son John thought it was creepy and tried to flush it down the toilet at one point. And Goldberry's introduction is seen here. I'm going to give you a brief reading from the poem The Adventures of Tom Bombadil. There his beard dangled long down into the water. Up came Goldberry, the river woman's daughter, pulled Tom's hanging hair. In he went a-walloping under the water lilies, bubbling and a-swallowing. Hey, Tom Bombadil, whither are you going? Said fair Goldberry. Bubbles you are blowing, frightening the finny fish and the brown water rat, startling the daub chicks and drowning your feather hat. You bring it back again, that's a pretty maiden, said Tom Bombadil. I do not care for wading. Go down, sleep again when the pools are shady, far below the willow roots, little water lady. Back to her mother's house, in the deepest hollow swam young Goldberry. But Tom he would not follow, on knotted willow roots he sat in sunny weather, dyeing his yellow boots and his draggled feather. The most definitive word on the nature of Goldberry from Tolkien was found in letter 210, in which he sent to one Forrest J. Ackerman regarding a possible film version of The Lord of the Rings, in which he sent his critiques. I'm going to read you the relevant passage from letter 210. We are not in fairyland, but in real riverlands in autumn. Goldberry represents the actual seasonal changes in such lands. Personally, I think she had far better disappear than make a meaningless appearance. So Tolkien found the potential film treatment's introduction of Goldberry to be so bad that he would rather that she not be in the movie at all than appear in such a fashion as a character from a much more childish sort of fairy tale. Here, Tolkien spills the beans as to what Goldberry represents, which is good and all, but he does not answer definitively what she is. Tolkien was clear as to what she was not. She was not a fairy godmother type character, and as per letter 175, she was certainly not Tom's daughter, nor was Old Man Willow in league with Sauron. And this was all depicted in a radio dramatization. And in this he states how ridiculous it is to assume that just because something like Old Man Willow is malevolent or dangerous doesn't mean they are in league with the devil. Note that Sauron is not the devil, Morgoth is the devil, but Tolkien is just using a common phrase here. And when asked once, this was in a video interview, he was asked if Sauron was the devil, and he says no, but he knows him. And this is important because the opposite is also true. Tom and Goldberry are good in that they are wholesome and benevolent towards the hobbits. This does not mean that, like Gandalf, they are allied with Manwë or acting under orders from God, Ilúvatar, in taking care of the hobbits. That being said, there was a time when Tolkien thought there ought to be 3 tiers of angels, the Valar still being the highest tier and the Maia the second tier, but a third one below this were divided into spirits of air, water, and light, the respective sylphs, mermaids, and sprites. Goldberry was a water spirit and someone who represents the changing of seasons, and this may be a remnant of such an idea, and of course her predating The Hobbit doesn't affect this, but only actually fuels the idea, as so too did the stories like The Fall of Gondolin. Instead, though, I would say that while neither Goldberry nor her mother is an angel, they are both spirits, as spoken of in the following quote from Av Aule and Yavanna. When the children awake, then the thought of Yavanna will awake also, and it will summon spirits from afar. And they will go among the Kelvar and the Olvar, and some will dwell therein and be held in reverence. And their just anger shall be feared. Manwë here is relaying the words of Ilúvatar, and he mentions spirits coming into Kelvar and Olvar, which is a way of saying fauna and flora, but this is Ilúvatar's answer specifically to Yavanna regarding protection of the trees, and one's mind really need not boggle that such spirits could be found in the air or in the water or in light. Okay, let's move on to the next question. Our next question comes in by the request of Curtis W. Sissons. I almost said scissors, but I didn't. It's Sissons, who asks, when Aragorn wrested control of the Palantir from Sauron, he told Gimli, yes, he beheld me, but in other guise than you see me here. So in what guise did Aragorn appear to Sauron? This is a good question. I like this question. There are moments, and they become more frequent as the story goes on, where Aragorn is seen as his true self and not the sort of dirty tramp that he presents himself as. Keep in mind that to most of the focal characters, Aragorn is a ranger named Strider who is disheveled, he's covered from head to toe in nicks and cuts, he's caked in grime. He cleans up nice. We see this in Rivendell, but that's just really clean Strider. It was not so much Aragorn, the second Elisar Tel Kantar, High King of the Dunedain of the reunited kingdom. Sometimes characters are afforded different vision. We see this with Sam seeing Frodo as this mysterious white-robed character holding a wheel of fire to his breast. We're also told that Legolas sees Aragorn's eyes burning with a spectral flame at one point. We also see it with Gandalf, who occasionally unleashes a little bit of his true self for effect, suddenly seemingly impossibly tall, with a booming voice that darkens the space around him. So what Aragorn is saying here is that through the Palantir, Sauron got a glimpse of Aragorn, not only as the very tired adventurer from the north, but as the heir of Elendil, carrying tokens of Telchar, Celebrimbor, and not quite Barahir. We're going to talk about the Ring of Barahir more in another answer later on. He was a hero the likes of which had not been seen since the Elder Days, and this is the way that Sauron perceived him. All right, let's move on to the next question. Our next question came in anonymously, and here it is. How did Sauron appear in The Hobbit, The Battle of the Five Armies, if he lost his body? Is it a different entity, or is it actually him? So, Sauron losing a body is always temporary, at least until his final fall. The body that Sauron lost after his battle with Elendil and Gil-galad, and in the film I suppose Isildur as well, was not exactly his first and only body, and he had very recently created that form after losing another one just a bit ago. It's important to understand Sauron's nature. He's not just some sorcerer, he's what is known as an Ainu, which is an Elvish word that transliterates to Holy One, which we would English as angel. Tolkien had 2 types of angels in his world, the Valar and the Maiar, the greater and the lesser. Sauron is a Maia Ainu. The Ainur are spirits, and as such they don't have bodies naturally, but they can cloak themselves in forms to make themselves visible to the elves and to men, or to whoever. These forms are called fauna, and they're only real in the sense that they can be seen and they can be touched, but they are not them. They are raiment, clothing that the spirits wear to make themselves visible. So an Ainu can cast away their fauna and not be diminished, just as you can remove your clothes and you're still an entire person. There are some exceptions to this when Ainur become incarnated, which means bound to flesh, meaning that the body that they inhabit becomes a part of them. They become like the elves and the men. Gandalf is an example of an incarnated Maia. Sauron was never incarnated. He always just used bodies like clothes, and he could cast them off at will or change them. Sauron was a master of shapes and hues and could shapeshift to different forms, sometimes even rapidly. We see an example of Sauron's ability to shapeshift in the story Beren and Luthien, when the Hound of Valinor, Huan, battles Sauron in his werewolf form and pins him down with his great jaws, and Sauron tries to change form to escape, but no matter what form he takes, he cannot get out of Huan's jaws. Luthien acknowledges to Sauron that she knows he can escape by casting aside his raiment, but warns him that it would be humiliating to return to his master Morgoth naked. So Sauron yields and agrees to leave peacefully, and he takes a vampire form and he flies away. He uses several fair forms throughout the years when he wanted to appear beautiful to elves or men. One of these he donned after the War of Wrath, when he surrendered himself to Eanwa, and in the Second Age he adopted a fair form called Anatar to deceive the elves of Eregion, and he taught them to make rings of power. He also seems to have adopted a fair form in Numenor after his capture by Ar-Pharazôn. The Númenóreans called him Zigor, and he became an advisor to the king, leading to the utter destruction of Numenor. In the fall of Numenor, Sauron went down with the island, and his body was destroyed, and his spirit carried the One Ring back to Middle-earth to take his seat in Gondor. He found taking a biblical cataclysm to the face weakened him, and he could no longer make himself appear beautiful, but he could still make bodies that were terrible or frightening. His body withered when he abandoned it after his defeat at the end of the Second Age, and his spirit fled to Greenwood the Great, where he made himself a new body, the Necromancer, though Gandalf eventually exposed him. So Tolkien stated that Sauron has a body throughout all of the Lord of the Rings, until the point where he once again abandons it to attack Gandalf and Aragorn and Imrahil at the Black Gate, but before his spirit, which was a lightning-crowned cloud of malevolence, could bear down on the captains of the West, the One Ring had been destroyed, and his form was impotent and blew away on the wind. His body in Barad-dûr died, and the entire tower collapsed, likely destroying everything else that was in it, including whatever remaining rings of power he held, though they were rendered powerless by the destruction of the One Ring anyway. So, as so much of his power was tied up in the ring, he no longer was powerful enough to make a new body. He wasn't dead. He could not truly die until the world died, but he was so weak that he could never trouble anyone again. But before that, yes, he lost bodies here, he lost bodies there. He would just make a new one. Sometimes it would be very quickly. Sometimes he would wait quite a while before he made another body. He would lie low, but he could pretty much do this at will until the One Ring's destruction. So much of his power was now gone, he couldn't make another body. All right, let's move on to the next question. Our next question also came in anonymously, and here it is. What specific heirlooms and symbols did Aragorn possess that made his identity unmistakable to Sauron? Aragorn had heirlooms that he showed to Sauron, and all of them were very old and important, and possibly they were all from the Elder Days. Now, I'm going to talk about this because I originally wrote an answer to all this that included 3 different heirlooms, and there was this, of course, the Sword of Elendil, the Elisar, and the Ring of Barahir, and I gave histories of all three, and then somebody in the comments pointed out that maybe he didn't have the Ring of Barahir at this point, that he had given it to Arwen at some point years earlier upon their engagement, and we don't really know if she gave it back to him to carry with him at any point or not, whether they passed it back and forth. So in this case, I'm going to say he probably didn't actually have the Ring of Barahir here, but since I went through all the trouble of writing a history of the Ring of Barahir, I'm going to tell you that. But anyway, so the first that we're going to talk about that, may not be from the First Age, but probably is the Elisar. Elisar means elf stone. Whether or not there was one Elisar or two is sort of up for debate, as Tolkien wrote two stories that claim two different things, suggesting that the characters who wrote the stories in universe were not sure themselves. The creation of the original Elisar is somewhat in dispute, but it was likely a creation of Celebrimbor during the period that he lived in Gondolin. The gem had two powers. One is that anything withered or dead could be seen as restored in the reflection of the jewel, and the other was that anyone who holds the jewel can heal wounds. The jewel was given to Idril, who was the princess of Gondolin. As she escaped the fall of Gondolin, it too survived. She eventually gave the jewel to her son Elendil, who made use of its healing properties, and he was said to carry the Elisar to the Undying Lands when he went with his wife Elwing to pray to Manwë to intervene in the wars of Beleriand. Elendil returned to Middle-earth once to fight in the War of Wrath, but he stayed in his flying ship the entire time and returned to the Undying Lands, though he would fly through the air holding his Silmaril, the brightest star in the sky. Now, there are two ways that Aragorn might have come to have this token. The first is that at some point Elendil passed the stone to the Maia spirit Olorin, who came to Middle-earth as Gandalf the Grey. Gandalf then gave the stone to Galadriel, stating that she would eventually give it to the man who would reunite the kingdom of Elendil and become the king of Gondor and Arnor. The stone passed hands a few more times, though. Galadriel gave it to her daughter Celebrian, who then gave it to her daughter Arwen. Arwen was then said to have given the stone back to her grandmother, with instructions to give it to Aragorn when the time was right. The other, and somewhat less favored possibility, is that Elendil still has the original stone, but a second one, a copy, was created by Celebrimbor. Celebrimbor was in love with Galadriel and gave her the stone as a token of his love, while acknowledging that he knew he could not be with her, as she had already chosen Celeborn as her husband. Galadriel would have used the stone's magic to keep her realm pristine during the time in which she could not use her Ring of Power, Nenya. Though this does actually explain how she kept the realm pristine in that time that she could not use Nenya. It seems odd then that, thinking that Frodo's quest may fail or even succeed, making Nenya lose its magic, that she would give it to Aragorn. I greatly prefer the thought that there was only ever one Elisar. It makes it more unique, makes it much older, and much more significant. The second token is Aragorn's sword, Anduril, reforged from the two halves of Elendil's sword, Narsil. Narsil was forged in the First Age by a dwarf named Telchar, and likely given to Thingol as a gift. We cannot easily trace the sword from Thingol to Elendil, but it seems likely that it was carried to the Undying Lands probably by Melian, and then possibly given to Elros by the Elves of Eressëa, and passed down through the Lords of Adunia to Elendil, who used it to battle Sauron. It was broken in half, as was Elendil's realm, but now Aragorn stands with the blade repaired and stands ready to repair Elendil's realm, uniting the men of Middle-earth against Sauron once more. Now, the last one, we're going to talk about the Ring of Barahir. Barahir was a very important man in the First Age, and he was a distant ancestor of Aragorn. His son was Beren, whose son Dior married Elwing, and their son Elendil was the father of the twins Elrond and Elros. Elros was the first king of Númenor. Now, as I mentioned, he may or may not have had the ring at this point. I've always sort of thought in my head, yes, he had the ring, but then somebody pointed out that he did give it to Arwen at one point. It may have gone back and forth between them, we don't know, but since I went through all the trouble of researching and giving you this very concise history of the Ring of Barahir, just enjoy it, I guess. Just enjoy the history of the Ring of Barahir. So, we don't know exactly who made the ring, but it was made by the Noldor of Valinor, and it was brought to Middle-earth by Finrod, who is Galadriel's brother, and he gave it to Barahir after Barahir saved the elf's life during the Battle of Sudden Flame. Barahir was eventually killed by orcs, and the orcs severed his hand and took the ring with it. Though Barahir's son Beren avenged him and buried his hand with his father and took the ring as an heirloom. Beren later used the ring to get an audience with Finrod during his quest for the Silmaril, and Finrod wound up dying to save Beren. It is possible that the ring was on the hand that was severed when it was bitten off by the werewolf Cockthroth. We don't know. Beren later recovered his hand anyway, and the Silmaril that he was holding. So if the ring was on that hand, he would have recovered it. Dior, who was the son of Beren, had the ring next, and it likely passed to his daughter Elwing, and then his grandson Elros, similar to the sword Narsil, winding up in Númenor. Like the sword, it was likely passed down through the kings until it wound up in the hands of Silmarion, who was the daughter of Tar Elendil, not to be confused with the other Elendil, who fought Sauron. At this point in history, women could not rule Númenor, so Silmarion, she didn't become the queen, nor did her sister Isilime. Instead, the king's youngest and only son, Meneldur, became the king. Now, interestingly, Tar Meneldur's son, Tar Aldarion, only had a daughter, so the kingship should have then passed to his cousin Saranto, but he changed the laws of Númenor, allowing his daughter Tar Ancalagon to be the first ruling queen. Anyway, back to Silmarion. She didn't become queen, but her son Valandil was given a title, the Lord of Dunia, creating a second line of Elros that was not understood to be eligible for the throne. After the laws changed, there would never be a reason for the king's firstborn to not rule, at least until Pharazôn took the throne by force. And this is the line that the ring was passed down to all the way to Elendil. Well, the sword, we know, was carried by Isildur, and after his death was brought to Elrond, and who then eventually gave it to Aragorn. The ring was kept by the kings of Arnor in the north, and eventually was held by the kings of Arthedain after Arnor split into 3 realms. And the king of Arthedain was sort of the rightful ruler, so I guess he kept the ring, and so the ring was in Arthedain. The ring was given to these indigenous Northmen by King Arvedui. He was the last king of Arthedain. He stated that the ring had no power, but it was important, and that if these Northmen ever needed help from his people, they could ransom the ring back in exchange for a favor. So that happened, and it fell back into Arvedui's progeny, the Rangers of the North, making it the property of the chieftain of the Dunedain. Now, the Rangers led very dangerous lives. They could be killed at any moment, so they left the ring in the care of Elrond, who gave it to Aragorn on his 20th birthday. So Aragorn, having, these important tokens, possibly also the Ring of Barahir, with a very long-reaching history, a dwarfish sword, an elfish stone, and possibly this ring, although probably not. I still went through all the trouble of researching it, which was made by the elves, but it was given to men. It's very associated with men. Not to mention the fact that he wrested control of the Palantir. This showed Sauron that Aragorn was not only his enemy, but he really meant business. He was prepared to bring the war to him in a very direct fashion. And then there's sort of a thing that's unsaid. The one thing that Aragorn did not possess, but allowed Sauron to assume that he did, was the One Ring. As far as Sauron knew, a hobbit was carrying the One Ring, and when he was last contacted by the Palantir belonging to Saruman, he saw Peregrine Took and assumed that he was the hobbit that carried the One Ring, and thus the One Ring had fallen into the hands of Saruman. Sauron sent one of the Nazgûl to Isengard, but they found no hobbit and no Palantir. And then suddenly, Sauron's contacted by this tall Númenorian, carrying Elendil's sword and the Elisar, and possibly also the Ring of Barahir. He fully believed in this moment that Aragorn had the One Ring, and he acted accordingly, putting all his eggs into the basket of attacking Minas Tirith, at least all of his southern eggs, his Mordor eggs. His northern forces had a different task, and this made it much easier for Frodo to traverse Mordor. All right, let's move on to the next question. Our next question comes in by the request of Matthew Heath, who asks, should Narsil really have snapped or shattered under Elendil if he just fell on it? Even if he was nearly 7 feet tall, such a blade that snaps instead of bending indicates poor steel, unbefitting of Telchar. Well, he wrote Telkar, but it's Telchar. How much force would even be needed? So, I got this question. I was like, well, I'm not really an expert in weapons. weapons. But you know what? When I did the research when I found somebody on Reddit who was an expert on weapons who actually answered this sort of question already. I'm going to put it up on the screen here by the name of Wotan Weevil. And I'm going to read this to you. There are two main reasons. It can't bend far enough. The amount of bending exceeds the elastic limit. Depending on the carbon content and the heat treatment and other alloying elements, the sword will either break or take a set, i.e. get a permanent bend. To minimize the chance of this, use a carbon content. Well, that's not really relevant, because this is a sword maker's forum. And then in the second one, it can't bend fast enough. Enough force is applied quickly enough so that a blade cracks instead of bending. How likely this is to happen can be measured using impact energy tests. And of course, he goes on about all the science and everything, because like I said, this is a subreddit for people who make weapons. And here's another important part. Both kinds of breaking can happen more easily if the steel is fatigued from being bent previously, has pre-existing cracks, forging flaws, poor heat treatment, resulting in large grain size. So let's talk about this. Now, there's a lot of science in there and some assumptions about materials and such, but let's examine a few facts about Narsil vis-a-vis this information. 1. Narsil was a very old sword forged by the dwarf Telchar, not Telkar, in the First Age. It has seen a lot of action. 2. A sword can break if it cannot bend far enough, but more importantly, it cannot bend fast enough. Elendil the Tall, he wasn't nearly 7 feet tall, he was nearly 8 feet tall. He was a very large man, and he was also very likely a very muscular man, and therefore he was very likely a very heavy man. And then add armor to this, and the fact that his fall was probably not this cinematic slow motion tumble. He dropped and he fell on the sword, and it could not bend fast enough, and it snapped, and the ground was uneven. That's important to know as well. The third thing we'll talk about is that Elendil had been using Narsil to fight Sauron for what was likely a very long time. So much so that the battle began at the Gate of Barad-dûr, ended on the slopes of Mount Doom. This is 30 miles as the crow flies, and Elendil and Sauron and Gil-galad were not flying, they were on foot, and they were actively trying to kill each other. So this means that we cannot account for a battle, of a few, hours. This is a battle of many days, possibly even weeks. The battle was, the blade was stressed, not just by the constant fighting, but also by the simple fact that Sauron was red hot. As Wotan Weevil mentioned, intense heat, such as the heat of Sauron's hand, can weaken a blade and stress it further. So a stressed and very ancient blade being used in battle that went on for days, if not weeks, coupled with the heat of being near Sauron and likely also cutting into him, and then a sudden snap as hundreds of pounds of Númenórean come crashing down onto it on uneven terrain. Even the very best swords may break under such pressure. All right, let's move on to the next question. Our next question comes in by the request of the Oski Bosky, who asks, if there are 3 Silmarils and 2 trees of Valinor, then after Dagor Dagorath, will healing the trees give life to the 3rd tree? Well, there isn't a 3rd tree to give life to. There was never a 3rd tree, nor was there any plan for there to be a 3rd of these special trees. I've been seeing this kind of floating around a lot recently, that it's somehow significant that Feanor created 3 jewels and there could potentially be a 3rd tree. Feanor created 3 Silmarili because the number 3 was really important to the culture of the elves for various reasons, going all the way back to the first 3 elves that awoke. There were also 3 kinds that embarked upon the journey to the Undying Lands, and thus 3 types of elves that lived in Aemon with 3 kings, the Noldor, the Vanyar, and the Falmari. Of course, Celebrimbor also made 3 rings. Later, Noldor, Remnant, and Middle-earth was divided into 3 states, Lindon, Eregion, and Imladris. I mean, I can go on, but that's where we're at. Elves just like to do things in threes. The trees were two because of their function, day and night. Laurel and the gold wax during the Valiant day, and Telperi and the silver at nighttime. There would not be much reason to create a third tree, though. If you want to get fancy with it, we could argue that the white tree of Eressëa, which was the progenitor of the white trees of Númenor and later Gondor, might have been the third, but it was not of the same level of majesty and power. It was created as a comfort for the elves of Eressëa, and its descendants were gifted to Númenor as a symbol of friendship between elves and men. All right, let's move on to the next question. Our next question comes in by the request of Erkin Yillen, who asks, what do you think? Tolkien died shortly after he wrote of Túrin killing the Ancalagon in the War of Wrath, so one of his late writings. So do you think Túrin fought in the War of Wrath and killed the Ancalagon? What is your opinion? Firstly, it should be mentioned now, while it was a later writing, it was not as if he died while working on this idea. His very last writings, he was most concerned with Galadriel, not Túrin. Secondly, it didn't mention anything about the War of Wrath. The reference is to a prophecy made by the wise woman Andreth, and was mentioned in the Problem of Ross section of the book The Peoples of Middle-earth. This is mostly notes on the issues created by the linguistic complexities of the word Ross, which usually refers to sea foam and is seen in names such as Elros. The essay was never published during his lifetime, as he came to realize that he was treading a lot of the same ground he had already covered in the appendices to The Lord of the Rings, and he rejected most of it. However, the part about Andreth's prophecy can be seen here. I'm going to read you this brief bit of The Peoples of Middle-earth. The language of the folk of Haleth was not used, for they had perished and would not rise again. Nor would their tongue be heard again, unless the prophecy of Andreth the wise woman should prove true, that Túrin in the last battle should return from the dead, and before he left the circles of the world forever should challenge the great dragon of Morgoth, Ancalagon the Black, and deal him the death stroke. This isn't new information, it's quite old, and note that he is saying that the language was dead and would only be heard again if Andreth's prophecy came to pass. Note that it says last battle rather than War of Wrath, suggesting that, like Túrin and Morgoth, Ancalagon would also return for the final battle. This is based on old information that Tolkien continued to revise and occasionally reject. He was just referencing it, not writing anything new. If you continue beyond that point in the Problem of Ross, it is laid out quite plainly, and I'm going to read you that section. In the sketch of the mythology, or earliest Silmarillion of the 1920s, the prophecy, with which it ends, declares that when Morgoth returns and the last battle of all is fought, Fionn will fight Morgoth on the plain of Valinor, and the spirit of Túrin shall be beside him. It shall be Túrin, who with his black sword will slay Morgoth, and thus the children of Húrin shall be avenged. The development of this in the Quenta tells us that in the day of the last battle on the fields of Valinor, Tolkis shall strive with Melko, and on the right side stand Fionn, on his left Túrin Turambar, son of Húrin, conqueror of fate. And it shall be the black sword of Túrin that deals unto Melko his death and final end. And so shall the children of Húrin and all men be avenged. And the final passage of the Quenta concerning the prophecy of the recovery of the two trees ends with the words, "But of men, in this day the prophecy speaks not, save of Túrin only, and in him it names among the gods." These passages reappear in the revised conclusion of the Quenta that belongs with the Quenta Silmarillion of 1937, with two changes. Túrin in the last battle is said to be coming from the halls of Mandos, and in the final sentence concerning the prophecy, no man it names save Túrin only, and to him a place is given among the sons of the Valar. If the cursory corrections that my father made, much later to this conclusion, he changed Túrin coming from the halls of Mandos to Túrin returning from the doom of men at the ending of the world. And against the concluding passage, including a reference to Túrin as a son of the Valar, he placed a large X. So there's a little bit of J.R.R. Tolkien and a little bit of Christopher Tolkien in there as well. We can see the idea of Túrin returning for the final battle dates back as far as the 1920s, and that eventually Tolkien rejected the idea of Túrin becoming a Vala in the late 30s. Christopher's conclusion seems to be that Andreth received a prophecy about the end of the world and mistook it for a prophecy about the end of the First Age. He notes that in every version of the War of Wrath that his father wrote, it was Elendil who killed the dragon, not Túrin, and that his father always used last battle, with capital letters, to refer to Diggoroth, not the War of Wrath. From this we can conclude that Andreth is just wrong. She made a prediction that Túrin would return, but thought the last battle would be the battle that ends the battle that ends the Elder Days. This wise woman of the House of Haelith being incorrect is not a new concept either. Her predecessor Adanal, retroactively related to her by marriage, as Andreth's nephew Barahir married Adanal's granddaughter Emeldir, producing Beren as a son, had some incorrect ideas about the doom of man, believing that all living beings were created as immortal by Iluvatar, and that it was early man's sin that made them mortal, a point that's refuted by Finrod, who had a lengthy debate with Adanal about the nature of death. So it was not, and we talked about that last week, by the way, so it was not Tolkien's intent that we believe that Túrin fought in the War of Wrath. It was Tolkien's intent that we believe that Andreth believed that this would happen. It of course didn't happen, because we know that it was Elendil that killed the dragon. It is my belief that Andreth misinterpreted her visions and gave a false prophecy, not by her own fault, but by her limited abilities. All right, let's move on to the next question. Our next question comes in by the request of Hao Chen, who asks, what if the Fellowship had decided to continue moving towards Moria's exit right after Pippin dropped the stone? The question here seems to forget the reason they were stopping, or I should say the reasons. The first reason that the Fellowship stopped was to rest. They had been through a lot and absolutely needed the rest. Keep in mind that they were planning on bedding down when they heard the howling of wolves, and that forced them into Moria. Since then, they had to contend with the Watcher in the water and trek a good way through Moria. If they had just upped and kept going at this point, they would have been exhausted, most especially Gandalf, who declared that he was already weary when he faced the Balrog. Imagine how much worse it would have been for him if he had not rested. The second, and I think the more important reason, was that they were essentially lost. When faced with three different options, three different directions to go, Gandalf had no memory of which to take. Keep in mind that though both Gandalf and Aragorn had been through Moria once before, it was going in the opposite direction. Also keep in mind that while Gandalf claimed that perhaps Gimli could help him navigate, Gimli had not actually ever been inside of Moria, and Gandalf's reasoning was that a dwarf would be less inclined to lose their sense of direction underground than he was. Lastly, let's, once again nip in the bud the idea that Pippin tossing the stone was what alerted anybody. If anybody alerted the orcs and the Balrog, it was Gimli, who sang this loud song that echoed through the chambers, and this was after this occurred, so yeah, they had to stop. But Gandalf didn't remember which way to go anyway. All right, let's move on to the next question. Our next question comes in by the request of E.J. Cohen, who asks, who are the two blue wizards, and can we use them in the Lord of the Rings role-playing games? In addition, is it possible for Gandalf or another wizard of Middle-earth to have an apprentice? So I honestly, I wouldn't presume to tell you what you can and can't do in a role-playing game. I would assume that you could use whatever characters you wish to, but I'll tell you about the Blue Wizards. The wizards in the Lord of the Rings are not the sort of wizards that you might be used to in popular culture, who are more or less mortal beings who can perform magic, either through learning it or a naturally born innate ability. Tolkien's wizards are the incarnate form of several spirits called Maia, which are a type of angel. Though they do have magical powers, the term wizard is derived from wise, and in Elvish they are called the Istari, or the wise ones. As angels, they once dwelled in Middle-earth in a place called Almarin, though they removed themselves to the Undying Lands after the land was stained by Melkor. When the elves awoke and were discovered, the Valar, who were the more powerful angels, fought Melkor, who was basically Satan, and a group of 6 of the Maiar protected the elves from this destructive war. Melian, Tarandor, Olorin, Hravendil, Palasendo, and Hymenar. So The latter 5 were called the Guardians, and Melian was their leader. The 5 made the journey with the elves while Melian stayed behind because she had fallen in love with a Sindar elf named Ilúthingol. Later, in the Second Age, Manwë, who was the king of Earth, became concerned about Sauron's growing threat in Middle-earth and decided to send several Maiar to Middle-earth in incarnate forms to assist them. We talked about what incarnate means earlier, along with an elf named Glorfindel, who had previously lived in Middle-earth. The first 2 volunteers for this were Taurendor and Palasendo, but they were now calling themselves Cúramo and Alatar. Cúramo wished to travel alone, while Alatar asked that his friend Palando, who was formerly known as Hymenar, to join him on his journey. Olorin was conscripted from their ranks, while Cúramo was asked to take Hrafndil, who was now called Eowendil, as a companion. Now, records are spotty on whether the wizards all came together, or whether they came separately, or the dates at which they arrived in Middle-earth. The last writings of Tolkien suggested that Alatar and Palando arrived in the Second Age, along with Glorfindel, while the other 3 wizards arrived in the Third Age, though Tolkien was always sort of changing his mind on this. The wizards all took names that were given to them by men and elves. They didn't use the names that I mentioned, usually with a title based on both their function and the color of the robes that they wore. The leader, Cúramo, previously known as Taurendor, became known as Saruman the White. Olorin was called Mithrandir by the elves, which means Grey Pilgrim, but he was most commonly known as Gandalf the Grey. Eowendil became known as Radagast the Brown. Now, the other 2 wore robes that were a deep sea blue, and they were given the names Morenatar the Blue and Romastano the Blue. They likely did arrive first, most likely in the Second Age, and they quickly went, we would say, behind enemy lines, to the lands to the east, Rhûn, and to the south, Harad. And these are areas that are off of the familiar Middle-earth map. These lands were occupied by Sauron's forces or were in league with him. When Saruman arrived, he did the same thing, but he later returned to the northwest section, and he settled in Isengard, while Radagast settled in Rhosgobel, and Gandalf wandered. No one in the Northwest ever heard from the Blue Wizards again. Their existence was only alluded to in The Lord of the Rings, as Saruman mentions that there were 5 wizards, with the other details that I provided coming from works such as Unfinished Tales, The Peoples of Middle-earth, and The Nature of Middle-earth, and Tolkien's published letters. Tolkien was never quite clear about what happened to them, though we know they never returned to the Undying Lands, nor did Radagast, who vanished sometime during the War of the Ring. Saruman was banned from returning, and Gandalf was the only one who returned home, though Tolkien doesn't state that Radagast and the Blue Wizards were unwelcome, just that they did not return. As Gandalf fulfilled his duties, he was filled with the sea longing, which is this strong urge to sail to the west. Either the others were not considered to have fulfilled their duty, and it is my belief that Radagast was not there specifically to battle Saruman, but rather to look after Yavanna's children, or they resisted the sea longing. At one point, Tolkien stated that the Blue Wizards went off script and fell, not like Saruman fell, but in their own unique way. He claimed that they set up cults of magic in the east and the south, and that they were the source of the modern-day mythology of what wizards are. He later revised his stance, claiming that they were not fallen, but rather worked against Sauron in more clandestine ways, fostering rebellions among his people. Tolkien hints that it is by their efforts that Rhovanion was not completely overrun by Easterlings during the War of the Ring. Rather, the force was enough to be repelled by the armies of Dale and Erebor until the fall of Sauron. The powers of the wizards are limited manifestations of their angelic powers, and thus they cannot make other people into wizards. This is going to the whole apprenticeship idea here. But they can teach wisdom. In fact, you may say that it was their primary function. Thus, Gandalf had several apprentices, such as Faramir. If we go by Tolkien's earlier thoughts, though, on the Blue Wizards, it does seem that they managed to teach men magic. It's just that men who learn magic from, angels, such as Sauron, are not called wizards, but they're called sorcerers or necromancers. I hope that helps. And now we're going to move on to the last question. Our final question is an anonymous one, and here it is. Why did Sauron wait for Frodo to come along instead of going after Bilbo directly? So Sauron never understood that Bilbo and Frodo were different people. Sauron knew what Gollum told him under torment, that the One Ring had been taken by a creature known as Hobbit, who was named Baggins, and who lived in a part of Middle-earth called the Shire. By the time he found this out and was able to act on it, Bilbo had given up the One Ring and Frodo had it. But as far as Sauron and his minions were concerned, nothing had really changed. All of the information that they had was accurate. The ring was still held by a hobbit named Baggins who lived in the Shire. I don't think Sauron or any of his minions ever knew that there were two of them and the ring had passed from one to the other. Such a revelation would be shocking to the Dark Lord, especially the idea that Bilbo could have given up the ring willingly. If Sauron knew that Bilbo had given Frodo the ring out of his own free will, this would have, he would have been horrified by that, and he would have taken measures that would have prevented the quest from ever being successful. He had come to rely on the thought that no one could willingly give up the ring, much less destroy it. But if he realized that Bilbo passed the ring to Frodo, he would have realized the strength of will that hobbits may possess and realized that a hobbit could potentially have the will to destroy the ring, or at least get it to Samath now. Or if this happens, Sauron may have been waiting there himself at the cracks of doom when Frodo arrived, and that, of course, would have been really, really bad. Anyway, that's all of our questions for this week. I had a grand old time answering your questions and doing live streams and all sorts of fun stuff on this channel. I'm going to ask again that you subscribe if you haven't already. If you got all the way through the video and you're not subscribed, I think this is the point where you hit the subscribe button and the bell and all the other stuff that you go through to try and get all the videos sent to you, or at least, alerts about the videos when they come out. If you want to support me in a greater way, consider membership. Membership is really cheap. I made it $5 a month. You get to see all the videos at least a week early, and you guys can tell the work that I put into this and everything. So, it really helps to be, get a little bit of extra cash flow there. Of course, there's ads and everything. That helps too. But I'm just saying consider it because you get to see everything really early, and that's really cool. At least a week early for question and answer videos, sometimes 2 or 3 weeks early for other videos. And you also get some emotes and a cool badge that you can use during live streams. So anyway, I will see you guys next time.